A once mighty dynasty that ruled across Europe turned against itself. In the smoke of civil war, brothers became enemies, and the crown became a curse. The House of Plantagenet did not fall to foreign foes, it destroyed itself from within. The story of the Plantagenet dynasty begins not in shadow, but in dazzling light. When Henry II ascended the English throne in 1154, he inherited a fractured kingdom, but quickly transformed it into a realm of order and strength. His marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine extended his dominion across France, creating an empire that stretched from the Scottish borders to the Pyrenees. It was a patchwork of cultures, languages, and loyalties, but under Henry's shrewd leadership, it became the most powerful monarchy in Europe. Henry II was more than just a conqueror. He was a builder of institutions. He established legal reforms that laid the groundwork for English common law, creating a system that still shapes the justice of the modern world. The king's presence was commanding, his intellect sharp, his ambition boundless. To contemporaries, he seemed invincible, the embodiment of medieval kingship at its zenith. And yet, within this brilliance, the seeds of destruction were already sown. Henry's fierce temper and unyielding will often clashed with those closest to him. His sons, Richard, Geoffrey, and John, were not merely heirs, they were rivals in waiting, nurtured on stories of ambition and entitlement. Eleanor herself, one of the most formidable women of the age, would eventually rebel against him, leading their sons in revolt. The Plantagenets thrived on power, but they also thrived on conflict. Every strength was shadowed by weakness. The vastness of their empire made it vulnerable to division. Their reliance on blood ties made betrayal inevitable. In the glittering courts and grand castles of this dynasty, whispers of discontent traveled just as quickly as proclamations of law. To understand the tragedy that would later engulf the House of Plantagenet, one must first see the brilliance of its dawn. It was a dynasty born in triumph, one that reshaped Europe and defined the very notion of monarchy. Yet history has a cruel irony. The brighter the flame, the deeper the shadows it casts. When Edward III died in 1377, he left behind not only a kingdom, but also a legacy of competing claims. His reign had been long and glorious, marked by victories in the early stages of the 100 Years' War, but it also produced a sprawling family tree filled with ambitious branches. At the heart of the conflict was the question of succession. Edward's eldest son, the Black Prince, had died before him, leaving behind a young heir, Richard II, but other sons of Edward III, particularly John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, believed their descendants held equal or even stronger claims. The Plantagenet bloodline was no longer a singular thread. It was a tangled web, each strand pulling toward the throne. The divide took form in symbols, the red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York. These were not mere emblems of beauty. They were banners of war, destined to drench the soil of England with kin blood. Families that once dined together now sharpened swords against one another. Marriages, meant to unify, instead deepened suspicion. Richard II's troubled reign only heightened the discord. Inheriting the crown as a child, he struggled against baronial factions and failed to command the loyalty his grandfather once enjoyed. His deposition by Henry Bolingbroke, son of John of Gaunt, created a dangerous precedent that a king could be unseated by his cousin. Once the sanctity of the crown was broken, it could never be restored. What began as a matter of lineage became a matter of survival. The Plantagenet heirs did not just believe they had a right to rule, they believed they must rule, or perish. Every branch of the family saw itself as the true guardian of Edward III's legacy. But instead of preserving it, they sharpened daggers for each other's backs. The seeds of civil war had been planted long before the first battle was fought. They lay in Edward III's fertile bloodline, in the ambitions of his sons, and in the precedent of usurpation that would haunt every generation to come. From these seeds, the Wars of the Roses would one day bloom roses not of beauty, but of blood. By the mid-15th century, the smoldering tensions that had lingered for decades finally burst into flame. The fragile authority of the Lancastrian king Henry VI proved unable to contain the restless ambitions of his Plantagenet cousins. Gentle by nature, prone to bouts of mental illness, and heavily reliant on his queen, Margaret of Anjou, Henry became a symbol of weakness rather than strength. The nobility, long dissatisfied with corruption and mismanagement at court, began to rally around Richard, Duke of York. A descendant of Edward III through two separate lines, Richard believed his claim to the throne was not only legitimate, but stronger than that of Henry himself. His ambition was not hidden, it burned brightly, and it inspired both loyalty and fear. England descended into chaos. Skirmishes erupted across the countryside, each one escalating in ferocity. Castles that once stood as symbols of permanence were sieged and razed. Common people, who had no say in dynastic disputes, found their lives upended as armies marched across their fields, demanding supplies and loyalty. For them, the war was not about crowns or coats of arms, it was about survival. The first battles were more than clashes of steel. They were declarations of intent. At St. Albans in 1455, blood was spilled between cousins who shared the same royal ancestor. The outcome did not resolve the question of succession, it only deepened the divide. Families aligned with York or Lancaster, not out of ideology, but out of necessity. Neutrality became impossible, as the Civil War reached into every parish and every noble hall. The Plantagenet dynasty had become a family devouring itself. Where once their power had projected outward to France, to Scotland, to the continent, it now turned inward. The empire of Henry II and Edward III was long gone. In its place was a kingdom bleeding itself dry in pursuit of a crown that brought no peace. What made the Wars of the Roses uniquely tragic was not merely their brutality, but their intimacy. The enemies on the battlefield were often kin cousins, uncles, nephews, and even brothers. The Plantagenet name, once a banner of unity, had fractured into rival war cries. The conflict tore through households. Noble families split down the middle, with one son pledging allegiance to York while another fought for Lancaster. In the halls of ancient castles, oaths of loyalty were sworn by torchlight, only to be broken when fortunes shifted. Trust became a fleeting commodity, replaced by suspicion and betrayal. Richard, Duke of York, himself embodied the contradiction. He fought not only against the Lancastrian crown, but also against his own kin who supported it. His death at the Battle of Wakefield in 1460 was not just a military defeat, it was the slaughter of a branch of the royal tree by its own roots. His severed head, mockingly crowned with paper, displayed on the city walls, symbolized the depth of cruelty that blood relatives could inflict upon one another. Even women of the family were not spared. Queens, duchesses, and daughters became pawns in the dynastic struggle. Marriages were arranged and annulled, not for love but for strategic advantage. Children were betrothed to secure alliances, their futures dictated by the shifting tides of war. For many, the bonds of family became chains of obligation, dragging them into a conflict from which there was no escape. The wars consumed more than lives, they consumed trust itself. To share a lineage with Edward III no longer meant solidarity, it meant danger. Each Plantagenet descendant was both a potential ally and a potential rival, and the line between kinship and enmity blurred beyond recognition. This was the terrible irony of the Plantagenets, a dynasty powerful enough to rule a continent, yet incapable of ruling itself. Their bloodline, once their greatest strength, became their deadliest curse. In the snow of Wakefield, in the dust of countless fields, Plantagenet blood ran freely, not at the hands of strangers, but of their own flesh and blood. The Wars of the Roses reached their dreadful crescendo at the Battle of Towton in March 1461. It was not simply another clash between Lancaster and York, it was the largest and bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. On that Palm Sunday, tens of thousands of men gathered in a snowstorm, their banners whipping in the wind, their fates bound to the ambition of their lords. The fighting was merciless. Blades clashed for hours, arrows darkened the sky, and the snow turned crimson as bodies fell in heaps. Estimates suggest nearly 30,000 men perished that day, an entire generation wiped out in a single storm of violence. Fathers, sons, brothers, all Plantagenet subjects, many of them distant kin, were slaughtered without mercy. In the end, Edward, son of the slain Duke of York, emerged victorious. At only 19 years old, Edward seized the crown as Edward IV, cementing the Yorkist claim. His triumph was decisive, but it came at a cost so high that victory itself felt hollow. Towton was not the end of the war, but the deepening of its scars. For the survivors, the memory of Towton never faded. Villages mourned lost men, noble houses found their heirs buried in frozen mud, and widows wept over empty hearths. The sheer scale of bloodshed shocked even a society accustomed to war. What had begun as a dynastic dispute had transformed into a national trauma. Towton became a grim symbol of the Plantagenet tragedy, that a crown could demand not only the blood of princes but also the lifeblood of the realm itself. The snow melted, but the stain remained, etched into England's collective memory as a warning of how ambition devours all. Edward IV's victory placed him on the throne, But the crown he wore was not gilded with glory, it dripped with blood. Every monarch of this era, whether Yorkist or Lancastrian, sat on a seat, haunted by betrayal, imprisonment, and execution. The throne had become a curse. Henry VI, the deposed Lancastrian king, was captured and imprisoned. At times, he was released, at times restored, but always as a pawn of others' ambitions. His fragile mind, prone to visions and breakdowns, made him unfit to rule in an age of relentless violence. In the Tower of London, he would eventually meet a quiet, suspicious death, likely murder, sanctioned by Edward's regime. Edward IV himself, though young and vigorous, faced constant challenges. His alliances with powerful nobles wavered, his marriage to Elizabeth Woodville angered aristocrats, and his own brothers George, Duke of Clarence, and Richard, Duke of Gloucester, harbored ambitions of their own. The Plantagenet curse endured. Loyalty was temporary, kinship was fragile, and treachery always lurked in the shadows. Richard III, Edward's brother, would later embody this curse most vividly. Rising through cunning and ruthlessness, he seized the throne after the death of Edward's sons, the infamous princes in the Tower, who disappeared under his watch. Whether Richard murdered them remains debated, but the suspicion alone was enough to tarnish his reign forever. For every Plantagenet monarch, the crown exacted a price. To sit upon it was to live in fear of daggers from both enemy and kin. The Wars of the Roses revealed the throne of England not as a prize of honor, but as a blood-soaked burden, devouring all who dared to claim it. In this way, the Plantagenet dynasty illustrated the darkest truth of monarchy, that power gained through violence must always be defended by violence, until nothing remains but ruin. The final act of the Plantagenet tragedy unfolded with Richard III, the last king of his line. His reign was brief but drenched in suspicion and blood. After seizing the throne in 1483, Richard faced whispers that he had orchestrated the disappearance of his young nephews, the princes in the Tower. Whether guilty or not, the stain of that mystery clung to him like a shroud. Richard ruled with determination, but his legitimacy was fragile. Many saw him as a usurper, his crown won not by right but by ruthless maneuvering. The nobility was divided, the people uneasy, and the Plantagenet dynasty, once the mightiest in Europe, stood on the edge of collapse. That collapse came at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485. Richard rode into combat with desperate courage, crying, "A horse! A horse! My kingdom for a horse!" According to later legend, he fought bravely, cutting his way toward Henry Tudor, the Lancastrian claimant, but fortune abandoned him. Betrayed by supposed allies, Richard was surrounded and slain on the field. His crown was plucked from a thorn bush and placed upon Henry's head. With Richard's fall, the Wars of the Roses reached their gruesome conclusion. Nearly a century of Plantagenet dominance ended in a single stroke of a sword. England stood scarred, its nobility decimated, its people weary of endless bloodshed. Yet, even in death, Richard remained a haunting figure, his body buried hastily beneath a Leicester friary, his name reviled by Tudor propaganda, and immortalized by Shakespeare as a crooked villain. The dynasty had consumed itself. It was not foreign armies, nor distant invaders, but Plantagenet steel that destroyed Plantagenet flesh. Richard's end was the final proof that this family's greatest enemy had always been itself. With Richard III dead and Henry Tudor crowned as Henry VII, the Plantagenets vanished from power. The new Tudor dynasty, eager to secure its legitimacy, worked to erase its predecessors from memory. History is written by the victors, and Henry VII was determined that the story of England would no longer belong to the Plantagenets. The White Rose of York and the Red Rose of Lancaster, once symbols of bloody rivalry, were fused into the Tudor Rose. This was more than heraldry, it was propaganda, a declaration that the conflict had ended and that a new dynasty stood above the ruins of the old. The Plantagenet name, once synonymous with power, was reduced to whispers in genealogies and footnotes in chronicles. Those who had borne the Plantagenet blood were treated as threats. Potential claimants were imprisoned, executed, or quietly eliminated. The shadow of the old dynasty haunted the Tudors, who feared its lingering supporters. Even Edward, Earl of Warwick, a boy locked away in the Tower, was executed under Henry VII's orders simply for existing as a possible rival. The cultural memory shifted as well. Chroniclers under Tudor patronage painted the Plantagenets as failed rulers, divided and cursed by ambition. Richard III, in particular, was transformed into a symbol of tyranny and deformity, his image twisted to justify the Tudor rise. In this rewriting of history, The grandeur of the Plantagenets was eclipsed by the glittering promise of a new royal house. And so, a dynasty that had once commanded an empire from Scotland to Gascony was reduced to dust in the annals of history. Their castles still stood, their laws still shaped England, but their name was spoken with hesitation, if at all. It was as though they had never been kings, only pretenders whose blood had been spilled for nothing. But ghosts never fade so easily. Even in their erasure, the Plantagenets lingered, shadows behind the Tudor throne, reminders of a past too violent to be forgotten. Though erased from power, the Plantagenets never disappeared from memory. Their castles, their laws, and their tragedies endured in the cultural imagination of England. Centuries after their fall, their ghosts continued to haunt both scholars and artists. William Shakespeare, writing under Tudor and Stuart monarchs, resurrected the Plantagenets on stage. In his plays, kings like Henry VI and Richard III became timeless symbols of human ambition, weakness, and downfall. Richard III, in particular, was immortalized as a hunchbacked villain, more myth than man. Yet it ensured that his name lived on far longer than his conquerors. Shakespeare gave the Plantagenets a second life, not as rulers, but as characters in the grand theater of human tragedy. Historians, too, found themselves drawn back to the dynasty. The sheer scale of their story, the rise of Henry II, the conquests of Edward III, the collapse into fratricidal war, was too immense to ignore. Generations of scholars pieced together chronicles, battles, and genealogies, fascinated by how a family that built so much could also destroy itself so completely. Even the common people preserved fragments of memory. Ballads and folk tales spoke of noble lords lost at Towton, of betrayal in castles, of the mysterious princes who vanished in the Tower. These stories, passed from mouth to mouth, kept the Plantagenets alive in the imagination of the nation. In modern times, archaeology gave them yet another resurrection. The rediscovery of Richard III's skeleton beneath a Leicester parking lot in 2012 stunned the world. DNA confirmed his identity, and his reburial in Leicester Cathedral drew international attention. For a brief moment, the last Plantagenet king stood once again in the spotlight, centuries after his dynasty's extinction. Thus, while the Tudors tried to erase them, the Plantagenets refused to vanish. Their legacy shifted from politics to memory, from the battlefield to history books and theater stages. They became a dynasty not of rulers, but of symbols, eternal reminders of ambition's price. The saga of the Plantagenets is more than the story of kings and battles. It is a meditation on the nature of power itself. No foreign army destroyed them. No external enemy brought them low. They collapsed because of their own blood, their own ambition, their own inability to share the crown. Their triumphs were immense. They built an empire that stretched across Europe, crafted laws that shaped nations, and inspired a cultural legacy that endures to this day. Yet their downfall was equally immense, a reminder that greatness and ruin often walk hand in hand. The lesson of the Plantagenets is stark. Power, when pursued without restraint, devours even those who wield it. Family ties, meant to bind, can become weapons when ambition turns kin into enemies. The Wars of the Roses show us that crowns may glitter, but they are forged in iron and blood, and they leave scars on all who chase them. And yet, there is a human truth beneath the carnage. The men and women of the Plantagenet line were not merely villains or victims. They were human beings, fathers, mothers, sons, and daughters trapped within the machinery of dynasty. Their lives remind us that history's great tragedies are written not only in crowns and battles, but also in broken families and silenced hearts. In the end, the Plantagenets stand as both a warning and a legacy. Their brilliance shaped a kingdom, but their fall reshaped it just as powerfully. Through them, history whispers a lesson that resonates far beyond medieval England. No throne is worth the ruin of an entire bloodline, and no victory can heal the wounds of civil war. It is this duality, glory and grief, that ensures the Plantagenets will never truly be forgotten. They are a dynasty consumed, but also eternal, living on as one of history's greatest cautionary tales.